They showed up with strobe lights flashing blue and red, screaming for me to get on the ground, their boots crunching on my gravel like they owned the place. But that's not where this nightmare started. Long before the handcuffs, before the lawsuits that made national headlines, and before the bomb squad had to deploy a robot on my front porch, there was just a sunrise, a cup of coffee, and a promise I made to the only woman I've ever loved. Peace. My name is Clayton Clay Vance, and I used to be the chief federal prosecutor for the Southern District, a man who spent 30 years putting cartels and corrupt politicians behind bars. But most mornings out here on the Ironwood Ranch, I'm just a guy with a bad back, a bag of chicken feed, and a desire to be left the hell alone. This is the story of how a quiet slice of Texas heaven turned into a war zone over a bucket of paint, a bruised ego, and the law itself. It started on a Tuesday, the kind of morning that feels like a pardon from God himself, with the mist rolling off the creek and the smell of sagebrush hanging heavy in the air. I walked out to the porch, the wood creaking familiarly under my boots, watching the light hit the old red barn that had stood on this land since before the invention of the telephone. My wife, Elena, was still asleep inside, wrapped in a quilt, and for a moment, I actually believed we had escaped the noise of the world. I told myself that out here, nobody cared about my past. Nobody cared about the convictions I'd secured or the enemies I'd made. That was the first lie I told myself, and it was a dangerous one. I was feeding the livestock, listening to the rhythmic chewing of the cattle, when a white sedan rolled slowly past my gate, lingering just a little too long, like a shark circling a raft. I waved, just a reflex of country manners, but the car sped off without a signal, disappearing behind the tree line with a guilty urgency. Elena had mentioned hearing a drone buzzing near the bedroom window a few nights prior, something I'd dismissed as local kids playing with Christmas toys, but as I watched that car vanish, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. You don't survive 3 decades in federal prosecution without developing a sixth sense for being watched. Later that morning, I found it, a crisp, ivory envelope jammed into the slats of my weathered fence. No stamp, no return address, just my name scrawled in an aggressive, thick marker. Inside was a notification printed on heavy cardstock with a gold foil seal that looked official enough to fool a layman, reading, Willow Creek Estates, Compliance Division, Courtesy Citation. It claimed my barn, my beautiful, historic red barn, was in violation of visual harmony standards and disrupted the neutral earth tone aesthetic of a neighborhood I didn't even live in. I laughed. I actually chuckled, crumbling the paper and tossing it into the bed of my truck, thinking it was just a confused neighbor with a superiority complex. I didn't know then that this piece of paper was a declaration of war. 2 days later, the enemy arrived in person. A silver Mercedes SUV kicked up a cloud of dust at my gate, and out stepped a woman who looked like she was carved out of ice and hairspray. She introduced herself as Patricia Patty Sterling, the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and she wasn't alone. Flanking her was a nervous little man holding a clipboard, Roger Baines, her vice president, and a woman named Brenda Holt, who was filming me with a cell phone like I was a suspect in a robbery. Mr. Vance, Patricia said, removing her designer sunglasses with a slow, theatrical motion, we need to discuss your noncompliance, specifically that eyesore of a barn. I looked at her, wiping the dirt from my hands onto my jeans, and told her politely that my property was not, and never had been, part of her subdivision. That doesn't matter, she smiled, a thin, predatory expression that didn't reach her eyes. Your property is within our visual corridor, and under our expanded bylaws, we have the right to enforce community standards to protect property values. I told her to get off my land before I called the sheriff, and her smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of cold, calculating fury. We have our own enforcement protocols, she warned, turning on her heel. You'll be hearing from us. They started small, the way bullies always do, trying to chip away at your sanity. Citations arrived daily, fines for unauthorized livestock, penalties for unregistered fencing, threats of liens against my property. I burned them in the fireplace, drinking bourbon and watching the paper curl into ash, thinking I was winning by ignoring them. But then the surveillance started. An unmarked van parked across the road for hours, Brenda Holt standing in the bushes with binoculars, and that drone returning at night, hovering just outside our bedroom window like a mechanical mosquito. Elena started closing the curtains before sunset, her hands shaking, the peace we had built evaporating like water on hot asphalt. It's about control, I told her one night, watching the drone's red eye blink in the darkness. People like Patricia Sterling don't care about barns, they care about bending the world to their will, and she hates that I won't bend. The escalation hit a boiling point on a Saturday morning that I will never forget. I was out by the tractor, the sun just breaking the horizon, when the roar of engines shattered the silence. A black pickup truck and two sedans painted to look like police cruisers, Crown Vics with push bars and decals that read Community Protective Services, came tearing down my private driveway. They boxed me in, dust swirling everywhere, and three men in tactical vests jumped out, hands on their holsters. These weren't cops. They were rent-a-cops, mismatched uniforms, no badges, just pumped up on adrenaline and a fake sense of authority. One of them, a guy with a buzz cut and a megaphone, shouted, "Clayton Vance, get on the ground. You are under arrest for repeated code violations and resisting Willow Creek jurisdiction." I stood my ground, my heart hammering not from fear, but from a cold, sharp rage. "Show me a warrant," I yelled back, pulling out my phone to record them. "You are impersonating law enforcement, which is a felony in this state." The leader stepped forward, reaching for his handcuffs, and for a split second, I calculated the distance to the pitchfork leaning against the barn. But then, salvation arrived in the form of a siren that was actually real. Sheriff Caleb Thorne, a man I'd known since we were rookies in the legal system, drifted his cruiser sideways between me and the fake squad, stepping out with his hand on his service weapon. "Willow Creek isn't a country," Caleb barked, his voice cutting through the noise. "And you boys aren't the law. Drop the cuffs, or I drop you." It was a standoff that felt like it lasted an hour, dust hanging in the air, hands hovering over weapons, until the fake cops realized they were outgunned and outclassed. As Caleb's deputies cuffed them and stuffed them into the back of the real cruisers, I looked up toward the main road. There, parked safely on the shoulder, was the silver Mercedes. Patricia Sterling watched the whole thing through her tinted window, and when she saw me looking, she simply drove away. She had sent men to assault me on my own land, and she did it without getting her manicured nails dirty. As Caleb took my statement, shaking his head at the audacity of it all, I realized this wasn't just a feud anymore. This was a conspiracy, and Patricia Sterling had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She picked a fight with a man who knows exactly how to weaponize the law. The dust from the arrest hadn't even settled before I knew we had to take the offensive. You don't wait for a snake to strike twice. You cut off the head. Sheriff Caleb Thorne promised me increased patrols, but I knew Patricia Sterling wouldn't stop. She was too invested, too arrogant to accept defeat. I called Audrey Mills, a shark of a civil rights attorney who operated out of a messy office above a bakery in town, a woman who hated bullies more than I did. When I laid out the photos, the forged citations, and the footage of the fake arrest on her desk, she didn't just get angry, she got quiet, which was far more dangerous. "This is organized crime, Clay," she said, tapping a pen against the stack of fake fines. "Racketeering, impersonation, unlawful confinement. She's running that subdivision like a cartel." We filed for an immediate restraining order and a massive civil suit, but I knew the court of public opinion needed to hear this too. We went to the press. Within 48 hours, news vans were camped out at my gate, broadcasting the story of the rogue HOA attacking a retired federal prosecutor. The headlines were brutal for Willow Creek Estates, and support poured in from neighbors who had been silently terrorized by Patricia for years. But humiliation is a powerful fuel for crazy people. Patricia held a press conference, standing there in a charcoal blazer, flanked by Roger Baines and Brenda Holt, claiming the fake cops were independent contractors and that I was a political elitist trying to destroy their community safety. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Elena watched it on TV, her face pale, whispering, "She really believes she's the victim, doesn't she?" That night, the lights went out. Not just a flicker, but a hard, sudden darkness that swallowed the entire ranch. I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight, the air thick and silent, and saw that the lights in Willow Creek Estates were blazing like a Christmas tree on the hill. Only my line was dead. I called Caleb, and when he arrived with the utility crew, the diagnosis was clear: Someone had taken bolt cutters to the junction box at the edge of my property. But that wasn't the worst part. Taped to the utility pole was a flyer with my driver's license photo on it. A photo that only the DMV or a background check service should have, with the word violator printed in blood red ink. Caleb bagged it as evidence, his jaw tight. "They're escalating, Clay," he muttered. "Cutting power is sabotage. This is moving into domestic terrorism territory." We decided to raid the beast's lair. Caleb got a search warrant for the Willow Creek Community Center based on financial fraud and the sabotage. We hit them at midnight. The place smelled of lavender cleaning spray and corruption. In the back office, we found filing cabinets stuffed with cash, receipts for surveillance equipment, and a ledger listing payouts to a shell company called Neighborhood Shield Ops. But it was a single USB drive taped to the bottom of Patricia's desk drawer that turned my blood to ice. It contained drone footage, hours of it, peering into my windows, tracking Elena's garden routine, mapping my fence lines. And then, I saw an email printed out on the desk, a correspondence between Patricia and a security consultant named Marcus Vane. I stopped breathing. Marcus Vane. The name hit me like a physical blow. 10 years ago, I prosecuted Vane for extortion and bribery. He was a fixer for the mob, a man who ruined lives for sport. I put him away for 20 years. He must have gotten out on parole. Patricia hadn't just hired a security guard. She had hired a monster who hated me personally. 2 days later, the threat stopped being abstract. I received an anonymous email, a video file. I clicked play, and there was Marcus Vane, sitting in a dark car, filming my house with a night vision camera. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. "You took my life, Vance. Now I'm going to take yours, piece by piece. The barn goes first. Then the piece. Then everything else." He panned the camera to show he was parked right outside my gate, invisible in the dark. I showed Elena, and for the first time, I saw real terror in her eyes. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. Patricia Sterling, in her blind quest for control, had opened the door to a man who wanted me dead. I spent the next 3 nights on the porch with a shotgun across my lap, watching the shadows stretch and twist. Elena barely slept. The psychological warfare was working. We were prisoners in our own home. Then, at 4 a.m. on a windless Thursday, the motion lights by the barn triggered. I ran out, heart pounding, but found only a slashed fence and a message spray-painted in jagged red letters across the side of my barn. "You can't win." They were toying with me, trying to make me snap, trying to make me do something illegal so they could flip the narrative. But they forgot one thing: I don't snap. I plan. I told Caleb to keep the deputies back, to let them think we were scared, to let them get confident. "They're getting sloppy," I told him, looking at the red paint. "Arrogance is their weakness. Marcus Vane wants a show. Let's give him a finale." I didn't know then that the finale would come with a fuse attached. The violence finally knocked on the front door at dawn. Elena woke me up, her voice trembling, telling me there was a plain cardboard box sitting on the welcome mat. We hadn't ordered anything. My gut twisted. An instinct honed by years of dealing with cartels screamed, "Danger." I grabbed Elena, pulled her out the back door, and we ran toward the creek while I dialed Caleb. "Do not touch it, Clay," he shouted over the line. "Bomb squad is rolling now." 20 minutes later, the ranch looked like a scene from an action movie. Armored trucks, a bomb disposal robot rolling up the driveway on tank treads, the mechanical whirring the only sound in the tense morning air. We watched from behind a sheriff's cruiser as the robot's claw lifted the lid of the box. The explosion was deafening. It wasn't enough to level the house, but the shockwave blew out the front windows and sent a plume of black smoke and dirt spiraling into the Texas sky. It was a message, loud and clear. They weren't trying to enforce codes. They were trying to kill us. Caleb looked at me, his face smeared with soot. "That's it. No more waiting. The FBI is involved now." The trial that followed was the most satisfying event of my life. The courthouse in town was packed, standing room only, cameras lining the walls. Patricia Sterling sat at the defense table, looking small and pale, her platinum hair disheveled, stripping away the illusion of power she wore like armor. Behind her, in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, sat Marcus Vane, looking bored, staring daggers at me. Audrey Mills was surgical. She didn't just present a case. She dismantled their lives. She played the tapes of the fake arrest, showed the jury the receipts of Patricia paying Vane with HOA funds, money stolen from her own neighbors to fund a hitman. When I took the stand, I didn't look at the jury. I looked right at Patricia. You thought because you had a title, you were above the law, I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. You thought you could buy intimidation. But real power isn't forcing people to paint their barns beige. Real power is the truth. The jury didn't even need lunch. They came back in 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, domestic terrorism. The judge, a stern woman who had zero patience for tyranny, dissolved the Willow Creek Estates board immediately and sentenced Patricia Sterling to 15 years. Marcus Vane, as a repeat offender, got life without parole. As they led Patricia away, she looked at me one last time, confusion in her eyes, as if she still couldn't understand how the world had refused to obey her. The aftermath was a slow, healing exhale. We won a civil judgment of over $1 million, stripping Patricia of every asset she had. But the money didn't matter. What mattered was the Sunday afternoon, 3 months later, when Elena and I hosted a barbecue. Neighbors from Willow Creek, the same people who had been too afraid to speak up, came over with potato salad and apologies. We repainted the barn, covering the scars of the graffiti, and on the side, we commissioned a local artist to paint a mural, a pair of scales of justice, balanced on a sunflower. Sitting on the porch that evening, watching the fireflies dance over the pasture, Caleb handed me a cold beer. You know, Clay, he said quietly, most people would have moved. Why'd you stay? I looked at Elena, laughing with a neighbor near the grill, looking younger than she had in years. Because, I answered, if you run from the bullies, they just find someone else to torment. Peace isn't something you find, Caleb. It's something you make. We claimed our peace, but it cost us our innocence. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? We trust these little associations, these petty boards with power over our homes, assuming they'll act with sanity. But how thin is the line between a neighborhood watch and a private militia? How many Patricia Sterlings are out there right now, measuring your grass with a ruler, just waiting for an excuse to kick down your door? In a world where anyone can buy a badge online and pretend to be the law, are we ever really safe on our own land? That's a question I think about every time I look at my red barn. But for now, the gate is open, the stars are bright, and the only thing watching us is the moon. And that is enough.